Next, I want to talk about some of the colonial period in Southeast Asia. And this is a figure from our book showing what's called the colonial spheres. So like other parts of the world, the Americas, Africa, that Southeast Asia was heavily impacted by colonialism and by a number of different countries, not just one, but kind of a wide mix of different European countries who were heavily involved in Southeast Asia. This is a figure from a different textbook showing the world in 1900, where during kind of the height of the colonial period. We've talked about British India before, which included, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, but it also included Myanmar or Burma. In fact, Burma is the name it was called during the colonial period. They've since added a new name called Myanmar. That's something that the country calls themselves, but oftentimes it's better. Burma might sound familiar as well. So parts of Southeast Asia were part of British India. You have French Indochina, so the French occupied Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. You have the Dutch East Indies, so the Netherlands, which are called the Dutch, occupied what's now Indonesia. And the Spanish occupied the Philippines, and then after the Spanish-American War, so did the United States for a period of time. So let's kind of start with the British. The British were heavily involved in a couple of places. You had Burma, now known as Myanmar. That was part of British India that we've discussed in the past. But over down here, you also had Malaysia, which extends from the mainland to the parts of the island of Borneo. And that also includes two small countries, including Brunei and Singapore, which at the time were part of Malaysia. The French, on the other hand, controlled Vietnam, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Collectively, this is known as French Indochina. And the British and the French also had a buffer state in between. This was an independent state that kind of served as giving some elbow room between the British and the French, and it remained independent, and it was called Siam. What was known as Siam is modern-day Thailand. So Thailand at the time was known as the Kingdom of Siam, and that was the one independent entity during the colonial period. So Siam is now Thailand, and it wasn't occupied by any of the colonial powers. Okay, that's primarily what's happening on the mainland here. We go out to the insular part. We have the Dutch East Indies, what is now modern-day Indonesia. And the Dutch, this is the European country of the Netherlands, occupied this colony called the Dutch East Indies. And it was a real moneymaker for the Dutch. And it had spices, when the spice trade was important, and a number of other products. So what's now Indonesia was previously known as the Dutch East Indies. The Spanish were involved. They were control of the Philippines. In fact, their control of the Philippines has a lot of parallels to their colonization in the Americas. Now, what happened is that, like some territories in the Caribbean, the Philippines were ceded to the United States just before 1900. And the United States controlled the Philippines for a number of years, up until the 1940s, I believe. And the Portuguese had a colony too. It's a real tiny one. It's called East Timor. So this little bit down here was a small Portuguese holding. Now, one reason that we're bringing up the Spanish and the Portuguese is they also have an impact, from the colonial period, they have an impact on the religious composition, where the Spanish, like to the Americas, also brought Catholicism to East Timor and to the Philippines. We'll discuss that later. We keep mentioning Singapore, but it's hard to see. So here's a blow up. If we go, this is Malaysia, this little tiny bit down here where it says Singapore, this is what we're talking about. This is Singapore Island. Singapore Island is a very small, essentially it's a city-state. It's a small island, it's pretty much all urbanized, and it's itself an independent country. Another independent country is Brunei, and Brunei is this little bit on Borneo Island that at one time belonged to Malaysia, but remained belonged to the British into the 1980s. One reason is that, you pull this down a bit, is that Brunei has oil resources. So it was kept by the British longer than the rest of Malaysia. Singapore, on the other hand, belonged to Malaysia, but gained its independence in the 1960s, shortly after Malaysia gained its independence. Malaysia became independent from the British, and then shortly after, Singapore became independent from Malaysia. And here is another view of East Timor. One of the current event articles a student sent in one time was interesting, that it talked about the name East Timor. So this is Timor Island. And apparently in the native language, that Timor means east. And in Portuguese, this, they just had the name Timor. They didn't maybe understand that it meant east. And they added the name Leste, or what's called east in Portuguese, to the name of the island. So in other words, this means east. So pretty far to the east, because it is the easternmost of this island chain.